Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, good people. This is Chris Capola, welcoming you back to A Fork in Time. I am joined today by one of my favorite colleagues. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, I love how you diplomatically stated that, Chris. Yes, it is Evan Buck. And as I always like to say, my fancy little show intro. Hey, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan.
I do feel like, and we talked about this a little bit before we started recording. I think this is kind of this is going to come into play a little bit when we get into the episode, but this is kind of a good bringing together the two forks of the team so that we don't bifurcate into an East Coast and a West Coast team.
We are laughing so hard at that because of where we know where this episode is going. And I think once Chris saw the rousing success of the Kai and Evan separatist Sonic episode, the Chris Central Committee decided to keep a tight clamp on things, keep me in line, and so he definitely did not forcibly decide to have me on as his very equal co-host. Just to make sure things didn't get a little bit too rowdy. But anyway, Chairman Chris has decided to give me the honor of setting up the fork for today's episode. And this was actually mainly my idea that I've bantied around for a little bit in our team Slack channel, the top secret A Fork in Time co-host Slack channel that we have. And
from an undisclosed location. It's actually hosted on an undisclosed server.
Quite literally. A server's based out of not Wyoming. But anyway, I thought about this because I was trying to think of different forks and areas where the show doesn't often frequently touch down upon. And one of the areas that we have been trying to look at a little bit more is Africa. And of course, leave it to Europeans to take a greater interest in in not colonizing Africa. But
listen, these my people are close.
There you go. But anyway, so we're going to be looking at. We're not going to go too terribly far in the Wayback Machine. We're going back to late 1950s, early 1960s. Sub-Saharan, I guess you can call it more southern Africa. We're right on the equator, actually. And that is an area that used to be known as the Congo Free State or Belgian Congo. And of course, it is now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in the first of many instances of clarification of confusing terminology that I'm sure we're going to have on this episode, we're just going to get this out of the way right now. There's two Congos that have resulted in our timeline, one of which is towards the west and was owned by the French, and they're referred to as the Republic of the Congo in our timeline. On the eastern side, we have what it was, again, mainly known as the Belgian Congo, which is now modern-day Democratic Republic of the Congo. But it was referred to as Zaire for, many, many years in our timeline. And so in this alternate timeline, without getting too far ahead of myself, we are not going to talk about French Congo at all, for the most part. We're not really going to mention them. We're not going to talk about them. So we're just going to, for purpose of argument, for purpose of keeping things short and snappy, when we talk about the Congo, we're talking about the Belgian side. We're talking about what is now referred to as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This will become more important later when we actually set up the fork. With that little bit of fine print and legalese out of the way. And yeah, Dylan, I had to make reference to you even though you're not here because, of course, even though there's no lawyer on the show to represent the legal side, I just was thinking of you too much. your absence on this show is very much felt. So there you go, Dylan, a little legalese shout out for you. So we are talking about the Belgian Congo in the 1960s. And before we get into that point, though, just a very brief note. I'm sure most of us astute history listeners who are tuning into this show are familiar with the concept of the scramble for Africa, in the 1800s-ish time frame, and then early 1900s. A lot of the European powers basically got together and said, hey, Africa looks like a nice big pie that we can just divide up amongst all of ourselves. And this was referred to as the scramble for Africa. So a lot of different colonial powers ended up with different chunks of Africa. France and Britain, I would say, just look at a map in terms of how large the areas are, I would say France and Britain got, the lion's share of results. We have, Germany with German East Africa. And we also have Belgium with a rather interesting situation themselves, because the area that we now know as the Democratic Republic of the Congo was actually administered as a personal holding of King Leopold, if I remember correctly. Like, it wasn't even necessarily seen as part of the Belgian state.
This is where we miss Dylan and his Crusader Kings.
Yeah.
They were held in personal union, not political union. In other words, they were technically ruled by the same people, but like the parliament in Belgium is too busy trying to decide whether they speak Flemish or Walloon to even consider dealing with. But in all seriousness, the King of Belgium is also the King of the Congo, but the administrative structure of Belgium does not have any standing in the Congo. I think it's the best way to explain it.
Yeah, I think you gave like a very good Reader's Digest version of that, Spark Notes version of a complicated situation. Good job there. But be that as it may, the Belgian legacy in the Congo, especially because of, King Leopold's personal administration and interest in the region, can very kindly be described as very exploitative and very harsh rule. This region is kind of popularly known nowadays as having the resource curse. There's a lot of resources there. This is going to come up big during the course of our episode. There's a lot of stuff that is there: precious metals, diamonds, and uranium. A lot of that as well in the region.
Don't forget rubber as well.
And yes, and I think that was the major source of a lot of the, the industries and the exploitation.
Literally in
the Congo.
1920s, they discovered how to make rubber out of petroleum, out of oil, which most of it is today. But at this point, if you're thinking about tires, if you're thinking about rubber gaskets on any kind of machinery, anything like that, it's natural. And it's coming out of here and basically like British Malaysia. That's about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so skipping over a decent sized chunk to get to fast forward things a little bit to where we're at, where we're going to take the fork in time today. In May 1960, there was a lot of rumblings of, anti-colonialist, pan-African movements. There was a growing nationalist movement within the Congo region. And on the Belgian side, this movement was led by none other than a man named Patrice Lumumba. And his party won the parliamentary elections in the Congo. And if I remember correctly, this was like the lead up to their formal declaration of independence.
So
about a month later.
What had happened is basically the Belgians administered an election so that they have somebody to hand the keys to. I think
pretty much because they wanted to get out.
Right.
Yeah. With the growing decolonization. So Lumumba, of course, in this parliamentary system, you have a prime minister, you have a president, but the prime minister is really the one who has the main authority from my understanding. So Lumumba, with being the leader of this movement, he becomes the first prime minister on the 24th of June in 1960, and Joseph Kasavubu becomes the first president of the country on that same date. Independence was declared less than a week later on June 30th, 1960. So now we got two Congos. Again, we're just going to refer from now on, Democratic Republic of the Congo. We're just going to shorten to Congo to avoid confusion. All was not well in River City, though. Shortly after independence, the Force Publique, which is basically the colonial administrative Belgian army, it was a very tiered, like racially tiered army. You had the local African black troops and doing a lot of the grunge work, and then you had the white officers, the white leadership. They didn't like this plan, and they didn't like independence. They didn't want any of that, and so they mutinied.
By the way, I think it's important to state the people that didn't like it were the white officers.
Yes, just to be clear.
And this happens in multiple colonial militaries, maybe even one that might come up later in this episode.
It very well might.
If you were a native African, you were not allowed to be a commissioned officer. In other words, you could be a sergeant. That's the best you could hope for. In other words, you'd be in charge of maybe 10 people.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Everybody else were white officers that were brought in. The other thing just to mention is this. You'll hear this thrown around sometimes. How many Africans had a college degree in the Belgian Congo when they were granted independence by Belgium? It was something, I'm going to say 3, 4. It was under 10.
Yeah.
In the entire
You could probably
country.
count it on two hands. Yeah.
Had a college education. And Belgium tried to hand over the entire country.
Yeah. And I'll also make note of the fact that in our timeline, if you do have these, highly educated people, they're probably going to be coming from one of a couple places. They're either going to come from the original, you can call it colonizer or host country. They went to Paris or they went to London, or they went to wherever to get their education and then come back. Or they're going to be going to Moscow, which might play a part in what's going to happen in the proceedings of this episode. But anyway, be that as it may. So the Force Publique, the white officers, managing a lot of the local African troops, they mutinied. They didn't like what was going on. And in particular, one of the provinces of the newly born country in the southeastern region, Katanga, which, just very important to note, has a lot of the mineral richness that is so vital to the country. They wanted to secede. They didn't like the new leadership. They didn't like Lumumba. They wanted to get out. And so a lot of the white Europeans that had stayed after independence, this was their opportunity. This was their signal to get out.
Well, I think one of the other important things is this. Mining requires a lot of engineers, a lot of skilled people. And so a lot of the, let's call them European expats, were concentrated in Katanga.
Exactly. And so you have, a brain drain. You have a lot of these people that could have helped with, wise mineral resource extraction.
Or, by the way, if the Belgians had developed Congolese people to run their own economy.
Exactly, as well, which would have been a good call. But they all fled. And so Lumumba is basically sitting here, and understand in our timeline, he is seen by different people and different sides as having different sympathies. Eisenhower is in office in the United States at this time. He sees Lumumba as kind of a brazen, naked communist partisan. A lot of people, including the United Nations, they see him as an opportunist. They see him as someone who he just got control of the reins of this new country. He's going to turn to anybody who can give him help, whether those dollars and those guns have the stars and stripes on them, or the bars on them, the crossbars on them, or the hammer and sickle. He'll take any comers. And so Lumumba first turns to the UN and he says, hey, can you help me to put down the secessionist movement? The United Nations refuses to get involved. So then he turns to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is more than happy to give a possible client state a little bit of help. They sent some supplies, they sent some advisors, and in August timeframe, the Congolese armed forces invade Katanga. To speed up the rest of our timeline here and to get to the fork in time.
This is one of those delicate balances we've had to do in times where it's how much do we want to spend on what did happen? Because
right,
you and I both like freely and openly admit we didn't quite know a whole lot about this coming into it.
Right. And we did have to do a fair amount of research and totally not punching into ChatGPT to figure out some possible ways to think of things.
I do not. I will come out and say I support human work, like
homegrown,
all the weird. We're recording this I guess the day after the Jar Jar Binks as Count Bernadotte episode dropped.
Oh boy, yes.
That was Photoshop. I do not like AI images for my episode art. But go on.
No, that is true. Yes, we support local, small, homegrown alternate history making. Exactly. But to get to the point,
Lumumba,
yes, exactly. But Bohemian alternate history. But anyway,
that's actually a thing that might be the next episode we do. I need to work on
really.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like a defenstration focused series.
Oh gosh, how many things can we throw into this before we actually get to the real point? I love it though. I love it. But anyway, so Lumumba ends up getting tossed out of office in early September by the president, Kasavubu.
Kasavubu says, I'm going to remove you.
Yes, not exactly necessarily the same thing. Lumumba ends up a couple days later making a big speech saying, hey, look, you can't actually dismiss me. You can't do anything about this. This is illegal. And if you actually look at the letter of the law, Congolese law gave Parliament, not the president, the authority to dismiss a government minister, kind of similar to how in the United States, impeachment is carried out by a vote by the House of Representatives with a trial held and conviction passed by the Senate. So Lumumba says, hey, look, president, you can't do this. So I'm still in power. The House and the Senate, they agreed. They basically said, Lumumba, you're still in power. But Kasavubu basically pulls an Andrew Jackson and says, you and what army? Enforce your decision. I'm going to go ahead and do this regardless. So Colonel Joseph Mobutu, about a week later, he comes into power. He stages a military coup with the backing, notably, of the United States and Belgium, and he removes Lumumba from power.
I am going to bet that Mobutu had not been a colonel very long.
Yeah, I have a sneaking suspicion that there was, absolutely no involvement from a certain 3-letter agency that has the letters A, I, and C.
Oh, no, I'm just saying,
whatsoever.
like, by rule, Mobutu, as a Congolese, could not have been a colonel for right up until independence.
Yes, exactly. They're just, wasn't on the job for very long. So in early 1961, January 17th to be exact, Lumumba is handed over to secessionist Katangan authorities and is executed, notably they execute him and then they dissolve his body in sulfuric acid, though. So they took a page from the cartel's playbook and decided to send a message to everybody, you don't mess with us. As I noted, Eisenhower, he was no friend of Lumumba. He kind of wanted him out. He saw him as a communist sympathizer, but the incoming president, at this point, JFK, John Kennedy, he sees himself as he's a little more sympathetic towards him and his plight. So that is the fork, or that is the what did in our timeline. And
Well,
we're going to consider.
let's just follow it through just a little bit.
Sure.
Finish it. Mobutu kind of is in charge. And lo and behold, when Mobutu takes over, Katanga doesn't need to be independent anymore. He brings it into his fold. Basically, he mounts a second coup because his first coup, he had been working with Kasavubu, the president. Mid to late 60s, he coups Kasavubu, and now he's the only person in charge. And renames the country Zaire, renames the capital to Leopoldville, to Kinshasa, renamed a whole bunch of, literally was in power. I
want to say it was until the Soviets collapsed in 91. Like, he was around for a long time, wasn't he?
I was going to say, what year were you born?
I was born in 96. Yeah, okay.
He was in power when you were born.
He was in power when I was born. Yeah, so this is crazy. Yeah, until 1997.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and so to make the implicit stated obviously, he definitely turned Zaire into a fledgling democracy with, freedom of expression, freedom to vote for whichever candidate you want. Definitely not a, uniparty one-man dictatorship. Not at all.
Not only that, but he also made it a point to use all of that mineral and extractive wealth for the good of the country and not put it into multiple Swiss bank accounts.
Yeah, no corruption at all. Nothing to see here, folks.
You take the political side. Here it comes. Check it off. Economic theory on your bingo card.
Hey, yes. There we go. Exactly. And I'm sure we'll get into even more of it as time goes on. So that is the what did. Lumumba basically gets cartelled, and Mobutu comes in and holds on to power until Evan Buck is born. In the alternate timeline, we are going to actually keep Lumumba around a little bit longer. And the way that we accomplish this is because in our timeline, he understands the nature of what's about to happen. He knows that he needs to get going. He needs to, get out of town and flee to Stanleyville, which is now referred to as Kisangani, I believe, as part of the, major renaming of everything that happened under Mobutu. He gets captured again by the Katangans and ultimately executed. In our timeline, we're going to have him get a tip soon enough for him to be able to flee to Stanleyville, coalesce a bit more support, and actually be able to have some semblance of power that he can hold on to. That's for lack of a more drawn out explanation. That's essentially what we're going to be taking our fork in today's episode. So, with all of that set up, Chris, where do we see things going from here in the immediate term? Because I think with what I set up in our timeline and with what I imagine he would do as soon as he sets up shop in Stanleyville, I think the first call he makes is to Khrushchev, personally.
Yes. Well, I do want to pause. Let's set up where we are on the ground. Yes. So Lumumba and his supporters in the parliament have fled up into what is today Kisangani, into Stanleyville, into the kind of northeast area of the Congo. Kasavubu and Mobutu are in Kinshasa / Leopoldville, kind of in, if you're imagining a map of the Congo today, that tail, that thins out and extends towards the coast.
And there's I think like an 18-mile coastline or something. So this massive country that has like most of the interior jungles of southern Africa just has a tiny little coastline. That's the area we're talking about. This little tail that extends it out west.
And the southeastern part is Katanga. So those are the major players in what's about to happen. So I think you're right. I think that he does call Khrushchev. I think one of the we didn't mention it. We did a episode previously on like the Aswan Dam.
Yeah.
Khrushchev has some friends that aren't too terribly far away. So I think they actually could, one of the things we talked a little bit about was power projection and the ability of the Soviets to get aid, help, advisor, supplies somewhere. They can get them to Lumumba in this situation via Egypt. And I think what we're dealing with here is basically Lumumba sees Kasavubu / Mobutu as the biggest threat.
Yeah.
So he tries to take over.
Well, and they have the control of the most resource-rich area in Congo.
No, that's Katanga.
Sorry, I must have misheard what you were saying. I was saying that the Soviets would be concerned about Katanga because they have the most resources.
Right.
But they're supporting the guy that has the more northwest
that has the legitimate claim, or a decent claim to political.
A decent claim. And meanwhile, in the southwestern portion of the country, we have what would be known as the more Western-backed U.S., Belgium, CIA, totally not CIA, backed guy. Trying to take over.
Yes, and this is kind of when is this gonna basically happen? Like mid to late 1960.
Yeah, around that time frame.
What else happens in November 1960?
Got a little thing called the election of 1960.
And because Richard Nixon was too vain to wear makeup, we get stuck with JFK as president. And I think one of what we envisioned here was kind of Tanga says it's separate, but there's two people saying I'm in charge of the actual nation of the Congo. And I think in terms of legitimacy, that's the bigger deal for Lumumba. Lumumba's like, first, I need a coast. I need access to the outside world. And from there, then we're going to talk about Katanga.
Yeah.
So I think he kind of, because he has, and this will not come up in this episode, maybe it'll come up in future episodes that we've already talked about for this. The United States may not necessarily be that involved in this yet, because we don't know who we want, who is a smarter person to back. In our timeline, we back Mobutu and he takes over everything. But in this timeline, our allies, i.e. the Belgians, the French, the Western-oriented forces, are kind of split between Mobutu, and I'm going to say Mobutu. Again, it's Kasavubu and
ostensibly, yeah.
Who say we're in charge of all of the Congo. Or Katanga, which is the actual critical part for them. Maybe they haven't actually coalesced as to what our game plan is in the Congo. And I think that might give Lumumba the opportunity to focus on the Mobutu government and actually take the tail, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah. Well, and again, it also bears repeating that, the outgoing American administration were the ones who were backing Mobutu. Kennedy, on the outset in our timeline, was more sympathetic to Lumumba. Mm-hmm. I think with I made a joke about this in the pre-podcast, how, Americans we struggle with geography and knowing where places are on a map, especially when it comes to places like Africa.
Mhm.
I will say, if there's rubber, oil, or uranium or diamonds or any kind of critical materials, we're probably going to be able to whip out our map and know exactly where that is. Or at least the military is going to know where that is pretty darn fast. And so I envision a very interesting scenario where Kennedy would be able to take the foot off the gas, I guess you can say, a little bit in terms of overt American support for the Mobutu regime. And he's not going to want to pivot. He's got other bigger fish to fry, by and large, with other, flashpoints. We're going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis coming up fairly soon. So I think this will be
this is before Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, and this is
if we're thinking about the Cuban parallel.
Exactly, right. No, and that's a very good point. And so I was just kind of giving a broader historical context here. But yeah, we haven't even had Bay of Pigs yet, obviously. Kennedy's just coming in. And so with his, I guess you can say pivot to Cuba, this can be an example where it's something that can just kind of fall off of the United States' radar, where maybe officially, ostensibly, we support or we're for Mobutu, but the man in charge who's just, switched horses kind of already likes Lumumba, kind of already has some sympathies for the separatist region because he wants to make friends with them.
Work with a Lumumba.
And we can work with a Lumumba. We'll keep a tab on, the conditions on the ground, so to speak.
And the UN comes back into this.
Yes.
So basically, after Mobutu's first coup and the assassination of Lumumba, the UN gets involved actually trying to negotiate a peace settlement here.
Mm-hmm.
And what we talked about, what we think happens, is basically Kennedy, the internationalist, kind of uses the UN, which happened in a couple of other places, to kind of come up with a deal that we're going to have a neutralization of the Congo. By the way, that term is important. That is exactly what we're negotiating in Laos right now. Did not necessarily work out too terribly well there because of what's other things that we'll talk about.
However, Vietnamese noises.
Yes, Vietnamese noises. Yeah.
Indeed. Yes. By the way, another thing we determined at the outset of this episode is we, on A Fork in Time, have a pretty decent tendency to take any of these episodes where we try and focus on a region that is undercovered on the podcast and find a way to loop it back to pre-World War I, pre-World War II, Europe and America, and our fortes in history. We're going to do our best to actually keep this episode mostly focused on the region where it started. Despite our mentioning, and of course we have to mention them, the other actors that are coming into play being involved, but we're actually going to do our best to keep things focused on Congo and South Africa and as a region in general, not as a country quite yet.
We need to say Southern Africa.
Southern Africa, yeah, not South Africa. Exactly. Yeah, and I think, Chris, is also good that you mention the UN getting involved as well, because in our timeline, the Secretary General, actually, of the UN, he dies in a plane crash because he's trying to jet back and forth between different sides of in our timeline, the Congo Crisis, shot down by Katangan rebels. And so I think it'd be interesting, and I still think something like that probably will happen in this timeline, probably even a greater chance of that, because now we have what we essentially have created is a split between 3 different Congos, or at least 3 different regions of the Congo, and 3 competing sides, as opposed to just one side that ends up taking over everything. Because, let's also be very clear, the Katangan rebels, one of the biggest reasons why they rebelled was because they didn't like Lumumba. They didn't want him in charge. So we got 3 competing sides. The UN still tries to get involved. The US maybe takes a little bit of a step back. With this environment that we've created, Chris, what do we think is going to happen, specifically when Lumumba calls up Khrushchev Well, what is the Soviet pivot in all this?
Well, I think the Soviet pivot is they actually have a client, somebody they can back in the Congo. They do back Lumumba. Lumumba focuses on unifying, let's just say the people that everybody agrees are Congolese is the best way to put it. Again, because of the legitimacy issue, he sees Mobutu as a bigger threat.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what winds up happening is he does succeed in taking out the other Congolese player, I guess, in the Mobutu side. The United Nations gets involved to come to an agreement that basically they want the world to recognize a independent Katanga to keep those materials and that wealth and that uranium out of the hands of the Soviet Union. And basically the deal on the table that winds up happening is, okay, Lumumba, you can be in charge of Congo, but you will have to give up this province.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I see that as something that pretty much all parties involved would want to agree to. I mean, obviously, Mobutu is going to be the military loser of this conflict, but I think there's a lot of precedent for that because, in our timeline, Lumumba has most of the government on his side, and I would say a sizable chunk of, the Congolese army would still be loyal to him. And so even though Mobutu is a colonel, he was probably only there for a few months at most. And he had heavy backing from the Americans and the Belgians in our timeline. So with this particular turning point, with the fork, with the fulcrum in history, I actually think that is a very plausible outcome. We end up having what is now known as, Congo, controlled by Lumumba. Mobutu is out, but we have an independent Katanga as part of the settlement.
I agree.
Cool. Episode over. Now we just end things, and there's absolutely nothing else we have to discuss, right?
Right, because there aren't still multiple European holdings. And, I think one of the things to think about here is, hey, what, thinking about, this is something to talk about from a European perspective. If you live in Marseille or you live in Paris or Bordeaux, you have a shared history. You understand yourself to be French. It's a little interesting that the Belgians did this because the Belgians are kind of one of the European countries that don't have a sense of being themselves.
Belgian listenership increases by 1,000%, and we start getting hate mail.
No, I am not taking a side, Flemish versus Walloons, but it's a thing.
It's a very big thing, yeah.
No. But
Belgium totally wasn't created as a rump state to protect against German aggression. Not at all.
Or French.
Or French. However you want to see it.
Yeah, it was French. Okay. Because when Belgium was created, Germany wasn't a thing.
True. Very good point.
However, Bohemian aggression.
How we have brought up Bohemia 2 times now, or Bohemian, because my reference to Bohemian was very different than the one you were referencing.
I'm gonna work in a third.
Oh boy, 3rd time's the charm.
The reason Katanga and Kinshasa are in the same country is because that was how much land was given to King Leopold. That's why they're the same country.
We want to talk about geographic illiteracy. Let's talk about the fact that the scramble for Africa was basically just a bunch of European rulers slicing up a pie with little to no regard for, local cultures, ethnic boundaries, existing kingdoms, existing history, whatever. So you would often have like maybe warring tribes, for example, or people that didn't really like each other super well ending up in the same, we'll call it now a modern day country or nation. Well, back then it was a colonial holding. And you could have a fault line, let's say between like the French side of the Congo and the Belgian side of the Congo, just for purpose of illustration. I actually don't know if this is true, but you could have a line dividing the same
or
empire or settlement.
What
or
you would
city or
have
whatever.
more is disparate peoples lumped in together.
Yeah, that was, I would say, the more common effect.
And because, hey, every single European colonial power was a NATO member, and this is happening during the Cold War, in a lot of cases, the anti-colonial people, the anti-colonial forces had support from the Soviet Union. So when you have,
let's not forget the Soviets started a lot their home country and ideology on this basis of every nation or ethnic group like deserves its own home country. That's where we get stuff like the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, which is one of my favorite little weird right turns in history.
Unless you're Ukrainian.
Unless you're an Ukrainian, exactly. But be that as it may, the point is the Soviets have a pre-built sympathy for and towards anti-imperialist, anti-colonial forces.
They have a pre-built sympathy for anybody who's shooting at Westerners.
Is shooting at the West, yeah.
That's but basically what we're getting at here is, in our timeline, because Mobutu's successful, the Congo does not become a base.
It doesn't become a flashpoint, really.
But in this point, it's interesting because I think it's a real possibility that the Soviets can use this as kind of a wedge to project some influence into a lot of these soon-to-be or recently independent states to kind of put their fingers on the scales. I think one of the places is Ghana. Ghana actually was one of the first countries actually granted independence in Africa. The person that took over was a man named Nkrumah, who same thing as Lumumba. There's always this argument of, was he a socialist communist or was he reaching out to the only people that would actually work with him? Wound up getting couped in the late 1960s. But if the Soviets have like the base of the Congo, can they start helping their friends in other places? One of the examples that we talked about is in Nigeria. Nigeria kind of has three main ethnic groups, one of which lives in an area very rich in resources. Have we heard this before? In our timeline, there was a war in the late 1960s where the Igbo people basically said, Nigeria, we're not Nigerian, we're Igbo. These are our resources. We want to keep them here, and we are not part of Nigeria. In our timeline, that was brutally put down because the government of Nigeria was pro-Western and because the Soviets could not get any support to the Biafrans. Biafra.
Yeah, I was going to say, is Biafra is the breakaway region.
Right.
Now.
Was the name of the Igbo state. So what we talked about is basically, the question of, was the U.S. disinterested in Africa because it was disinterested in Africa and couldn't find these places on a map? Also, the fact that they're constantly changing the names of these things didn't help.
Yeah, exactly.
However, or was it in our timeline the fact that you know what? Things kept happening our way. We weren't seriously challenged in any of these places, so we didn't have to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what sets up something that's very interesting in the alternate timeline, because in our timeline, like we still had, and I'm sure we'll touch upon this in this episode as well, but we still had like, Cold War flashpoints, in Africa at various points. We still had some degree of involvement with Americans, funneling aid to different, uh, groups or militias, Soviets doing the same, whatever. But definitely it was much more undercover or not as highly publicized as certain larger conflicts were.
Because we kept winning, because the
Right.
other side never showed up.
Yeah, exactly. And we had both the Americans and the Soviets ended up, focusing more of their time and attention on other bigger theaters. And I do think in the alternate timeline, well, let's talk about our timeline first. I wanted to throw this in here, and this can be something that I think will develop into something very interesting in the alternate timeline. But we have, and I think a lot of what happens in, American politics, Soviets, whatever, it doesn't change with what goes on in Africa. And this is why I like this episode, is because we're actually focusing on a lot of the changes that happen in Africa, because most of the changes are mainly localized there. But it does have impacts, of course, for the Cold War. I do see something very interesting fomenting with the Sino-Russian split that happened in our timeline. I still think a lot of the same things, and for a lot of the same reasons, those end up happening in the alternate timeline as well. But my mind immediately went to what happens in our time, that has been happening a lot in our timeline recently over the last maybe 20, 30 years or so. You will often occasionally see headlines about how the Chinese have built a new stadium somewhere in East Africa, or has invested in some big infrastructure project. In a lot of ways, I would say that the Chinese have become what the Russians wanted to be, and they were, by helping to fund the, the dam project in Egypt. The Chinese have basically done that here in our timeline. In the alternate timeline, I can see an increased focus and attention from both the West and the Soviets in Africa as attracting the attention of the Chinese as well, even faster than it did, and to a greater extent earlier, I would say earlier than in our timeline.
I think, one, you don't have quite the economics that you're talking about, because I think some of modern China's resource hungriness comes after Deng Xiaoping's reform.
I was going to say, like, Mao is still in power for a lot of, and Maoist kind of governments are, I would say, pre-reform governments. Let's put it that way.
Pre-Deng governments.
Pre-Deng governments are still leading China at this point.
Right. Now, the thing I do think is interesting is there is a split within the communist bloc.
Yeah.
It's scary to talk about it, but it plays out in a lot of peripheral communist countries. Talking about Cuba, you have kind of the pro-Russians saying, we're communists, we're eventually going to win, we need to compete with the West economically, and the very nature of our system will carry us through. You have the Chinese saying, you know what? Let the nukes fly. Like, peaceful coexistence is not necessarily a goal. One of the interesting things is, in Cuba, you want to know how that plays out? They kick out Che Guevara because he was kind of making the People's War, peasant, like, peaceful coexistence isn't necessarily a good thing for us argument. And they actually send him to the modern Congo and have him fight some of the people that still are, for the lack of a better phrase, Simba's were like keeping Lumumba's aims alive, but they just didn't have his leadership, and that wound up not working out for them. I think what we're getting at, though, is this does provide a really interesting argument that, like, this is another of those fields where they can be competing against each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely see that. And I think just contrasting what happens, especially like keeping it back to Congo for a bit, I think the biggest way we can contrast what happens to the Congo and that region in the alternate timeline versus what happens in our timeline is, I mean, the biggest one, of course, is an independent Katanga or Katanga. And, they're able to have, maybe not 100,000, but a decent number of those people who originally fled. They'll probably be able to come back in as expats or be able to train people on the ground and actually be able to successfully extract a lot of those resources. The modern Congo region, very war ravaged, very, mineral rich, but one of the poorest regions in the world. I think you'll have Lumumba. You can almost, one of the characters that I was thinking about, but for very different reasons, I'm going to say that I can compare Lumumba to in this alternate timeline is Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh ends up getting a little bit mad, just a wee bit mad at the West because his letters get ignored. And that's, on a kind of a pragmatic, practical sense. He wasn't really an ideological communist. He was more of a anti-colonialist.
I also have to say that the United States literally, like, funding the French to bomb and occupy his country had a little more to do with it than Truman leading him on red. Okay.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a very good point. But be that as it may, I can see Lumumba evolving into, somewhat not as much of a Ho Chi Minh figure, but a little bit more of you can call a pragmatic communist, one who aligns himself with the more Soviet bloc because he's content.
It's not just Ho Chi Minh. I mean, the same argument you will hear about people talking about Fidel Castro. You will also hear people use similar ways to think about Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who, I mean, was not outlawed the Egyptian Communist Party, but was very happy to accept Soviet support for his aims. So I think there are a lot of people in the third world, in the non-aligned world. I mean, if we really want to throw it out there, Tito in Yugoslavia was a communist, but he wasn't a Soviet stooge.
Right. Exactly. I think the kind of what I'm trying to get across here is he's very much more than content to be able to have his slice of, the interior region, the jungle, the small bit of coastline he's able to get.
He's not happy.
Well, he's not thrilled, but it's definitely better than the alternative, which I figure even in this time, in the alternate timeline, Lumumba would have understood that if he was caught by the Katangans and caught by the Belgians and CIA-backed people, it wouldn't have ended up well for him. So he's maybe not thrilled, but he's definitely happy to be alive and ruling his slice of the kingdom. So, but I think the main takeaway I get from this is that we have a much more, more Western and Soviet involvement, potential Chinese involvement increased, and more fracture lines. Like, not even just like within these countries, but we could actually be seeing completely different countries as well on the modern map, or at least at this stage, we'll definitely see more countries on the map. Because there is going to be more overt backing from different sides, more of a incentive for breakaway regions to actually break away and be successful with it. It's not that there's any lack of motivation for that in our timeline, but I would say that there is more of a strong resistance to those revolutionary movements in our timeline. In the alternate timeline, there's going to be more Soviet attention and funding for those, those counter movements. So I think that's a very interesting world to ponder. I think it's one where you see different parts. I'm not going to necessarily make the comparison as strict between, like West and East Germany, for example, but you're probably going to see some very definite, we'll just take Human Development Index, right? HDI. You'll see, a decent bit higher HDI in regions like Katanga versus, the more Eastern aligned Soviet blocs. But there also are probably going to be examples of countries like
if we're
Egypt
really talking,
and yeah, go ahead.
You're going to have you might have more different HDI. You're also going to have a pretty skewed Gini coefficient. You might have hospitals. You might have power stations.
Yeah,
you might
exactly.
have airports and infrastructure, but those are not going to be accessible to a lot of the population.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so I think as we kind of start taxing or start bringing this down to a close, we've roughly taken this alternate timeline with Lumumba sticking around. We'll call it, maybe the late 60s, start of the 70s, early 70s timeframe. Chris and I already have ideas for a very interesting neighboring country close by in the neighborhood that could set us up well for a potential part 2. But I think, Chris, you're the right man for the job to introduce said country, introduce where we might be going, cast dispersions towards this country, and that can set us off into the sunset.
So I'm going to get there in a second.
Yes, the threatened Chris nuke.
I am not dropping that Chris nuke. I'm dropping another nuke, which is going to be the third Bohemian mention.
Okay.
Not long after Lumumba actually solidified his control in Congo, and to Americans, this is all kind of a African almost seems like a coup soup. There's always a coup going on somewhere. One of them.
You mean Africa's not a country, Chris?
Huh?
You mean Africa's not a country, Chris?
No, it's not. One of them that happened in Tanzania, which was kind of a merger of two other colonies, overthrew the Sultan of Zanzibar. When that happened, there was a Indian family that had been living there that had to flee to Great Britain. One of their sons who had to flee Zanzibar as a child was Freddie Mercury.
That's where the next Bohemia reference comes in. I was like, how is Bohemian Rhapsody going to be involved here? Because I knew that's what it had to be. Man, I love it. I absolutely love it. Well, how much we're talking about nukes here at the end of the episode? There actually is a lot of uranium in Katanga. So there you go. And talk about yellow cakes. We can bring up yellow cakes in Niger. Right?
I feel so happy that you now know what yellow cake means.
Now I actually know what that is. Yeah.
However, where we want to set up is Angola, which is right next door, which is going to be actually, if you look at a map, Angola is actually split. There's a tiny little bit of Angola north of the tail of Congo.
The tiny little stretch that Congo has on the South Atlantic coast. Yeah.
It actually splits Angola.
I think it's called Cabinda, if I remember right.
That's what the
part
northern
of Angola that's separate.
enclave is. Yeah.
Yeah.
In 1975, it blows up, and I think this is going to be a really important thing for that, because if you want to talk about my sparks noticing of topics, literally in the I was like, ooh, Angola, and I think Evan's reaction literally was TLDR.
Yeah, I'm just like, the last time I tried to look at the Wikipedia page for the Angolan independence movement and the Angolan Civil War, I got a headache. It's hard to keep track of.
But we're thinking about that next time.
Yes.
So yeah, we by the way, we touched on a couple of different places. I think Tito and Bohemia might have been the only European references.
I think you're right.
Other than making fun of Walloons and Flemish.
Yes, exactly.
Well,
I think
we kept it out of the big ones.
We can't help ourselves. We can't help ourselves. We gotta. Yeah, we at the very least, I think, accomplished our main objective, which was to keep the African episode for Africans. So there you go. Yeah. I think we did a good job of that, Chris. Any other last minute things you want to mention, or
not particularly
burning questions, burning issues? The only one that I am going to just briefly mention is just a tiny bit of trivia with regards to Lumumba's actual fate in our timeline. Like I said, he gets dissolved in acid, so apparently there's absolutely nothing of him left, except the Belgians, for some reason. So in 2002, it took until basically 2002 for the Belgians to basically say, hey, we're sorry. Like, we played a big role in this. We're sorry. But in 2022, so 20 years later, apparently they still had one tooth of the guy. Now, I haven't looked into why they have this tooth. I don't know how it was recovered, whatever. But the Belgians basically sent the tooth back to Lumumba's surviving family. Mm-hmm. So in this alternate timeline, the Belgian tooth fairy does not come for Lumumba. He retains all of his uppers and lowers, not dissolved in acid. Everything, at least for Lumumba, should come to a fairly, I won't say happy ending, but at least a not horrible, a normal ending. Yeah, exactly. But that was the last thing that I wanted to mention here at the very end. Now we get to our sundry closing duties. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and listening to this episode of A Fork in Time. As always, sound off on the Discord. Let us know what you think. Other areas that maybe we didn't cover, or areas of agreement, disagreement. We love our community on there. And as we always like to ask on A Fork in Time, if you happen to stumble across a fork in time, what, pray tell, do you think we should do with it?
Get off the road, get on a steamship, and spend the next 3 hours traveling upriver into the heart of darkness.
Ooh. I like that. That is a deep cut. I love that. I thought you were going to make a reference towards steaming up and going down a fork of the Congo River. But
I mean, that's kind of what it is.
Basically what it is. You just didn't explicitly state the Congo River.
And I feel like I deserve some credit and some acknowledgement for not turning that into an Apocalypse Now joke.
You know what? I'll give you credit where credit is due. Good job, Chris. But yes, as we always like to end off our episodes, if you stumble across a fork in time, we think you should take it. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.